Necronomicon. The Necronomicon is probably the most famous forbidden book that never actually existed. It was created by American horror writer H.P. Lovecraft during the 1920s as part of his fictional universe. According to his stories, the book was written by a mad Arab named Abdul al-Hazred centuries ago and contained knowledge that humanity was never supposed to discover. Inside the stories, the Necronomicon supposedly described ancient beings known as the Great Old Ones, powerful entities that had existed long before humanity itself. It claimed they were not truly dead, but merely sleeping beneath the earth or beyond human reality, waiting for the right conditions to awaken. The book also described forgotten languages, strange symbols, and rituals, supposedly capable of contacting these entities. One famous passage suggests that is not dead which can eternal lie, and with strange aeons even death may die, implying that these ancient beings could one day return. Lovecraft also wrote that reading the Necronomicon came with a terrible price. People who studied it often descended into madness after learning truths the human mind was never meant to understand. Some ended up in mental institutions, while others became completely consumed by obsession. In Lovecraft's universe, the greatest horror wasn't being killed by monsters. It was realizing just how insignificant humanity was in a universe ruled by incomprehensible cosmic beings. The myth became so convincing that publishers eventually started printing fake versions of the Necronomicon and selling them as genuine books. The most famous was the Simon Necronomicon, published in 1977, which claimed to contain authentic ancient rituals and magical ceremonies. However, it isn't completely banned from being read, but its content is somewhat restricted. The Anarchist Cookbook. When William Powell published The Anarchist Cookbook in 1971, he was only 19 years old. At the time, the United States was experiencing widespread protests, political unrest, and the Vietnam War. Powell said he wanted to create a survival guide for people who distrusted the government. Instead, he ended up writing one of the most controversial books ever published. The book contains instructions related to homemade explosives, sabotage, lockpicking, improvised weapons, and other dangerous activities. It even claimed to explain how to manufacture explosives using materials that were commonly available at the time. Though later criticized as outdated and unsafe, the book became infamous as a manual for dangerous activities. The controversy didn't stop with the book itself. Over the following decades, investigators repeatedly found copies connected to real criminal cases. One of the most well-known examples involved the 1999 Columbine High School shooting. Reports alleged that at least one attacker owned the book and copied some of its ideas into personal notes. It has also been referenced in investigations involving other violent incidents, including bomb plots and extremist attacks. As a result, many schools, libraries, and bookstores either removed it from their shelves or heavily restricted access. Perhaps the biggest twist came years later. William Powell eventually rejected the book himself. After becoming a teacher, he publicly expressed deep regret over publishing it, saying he no longer agreed with its message and wished it had never been released. However, because he had already sold the publishing rights shortly after publication, he had no legal way to stop new editions from being printed. Exquisite Corpse. Written by American author Poppy Z. Bright, Exquisite Corpse was first published in 1996 and quickly became infamous for pushing psychological horror far beyond what most readers expected. The story follows two serial killers whose paths eventually cross in New Orleans. One of them, Andrew Compton, is loosely inspired by British serial killer Dennis Nilsen, while the other, Jay Byrne, draws inspiration from Jeffrey Dahmer. Instead of following detectives trying to catch them, the novel places readers almost entirely inside the minds of the killers themselves, allowing them to witness every disturbing thought, fantasy, and justification behind their crimes. What made the novel so controversial wasn't just the violence. It contains graphic themes involving cannibalism, necrophilia, torture, and extreme abuse, but many readers say the psychological horror is even worse. In one scene, a killer calmly reflects that murder has become so routine that he barely feels anything anymore, treating human life as if it were completely meaningless. As the two killers grow closer, they begin viewing their victims less as people and more as objects to satisfy their darkest desires. Because of its graphic content, Exquisite Corpse has been restricted by some libraries and bookstores over the years and frequently appears on lists of the most disturbing horror novels ever written. The Girl Next Door. In 1989, American author Jack Ketchum published what many readers still consider the most disturbing horror novel ever written. The Girl Next Door was inspired by one of the most horrifying real murder cases in American history, the 1965 killing of 16-year-old Sylvia Likens. The novel follows a teenage boy named David, who watches as two sisters are left in the care of a woman named Ruth Chandler. At first, everything seems normal, but after Ruth begins taking out her anger on one of the girls, the abuse slowly becomes worse. What starts as punishment turns into weeks of imprisonment, starvation, humiliation, and relentless torture. She is eventually locked inside a basement, repeatedly beaten, burned, and denied even the most basic necessities. Even more disturbing, some neighborhood children begin taking part in the abuse themselves, treating it as if it were some kind of game, while the adults around them do almost nothing to stop it. Although Ketchum changed the names and some details, the novel closely mirrors the real Sylvia Likens case. In reality, Sylvia was left in the care of Gertrude Baniszewski while her parents traveled for work. Over the course of several months, Sylvia endured unimaginable abuse before eventually dying from her injuries. Due to its graphic subject matter, The Girl Next Door has been banned in some schools and libraries over the years. Even today, countless horror fans describe it as one of the few books they never want to read a second time. The Painted Bird. When The Painted Bird was published in 1965 by Polish-born writer Jerzy Kosinski, it immediately became one of the most controversial war novels ever written. For years, many readers believed it was the author's own childhood memoir from the Second World War. Later, however, historians questioned how much of the story was factual and how much had been fictionalized, creating a debate that lasted for decades. The novel follows a young boy who wanders alone through Eastern Europe after becoming separated from his family during the war. Hoping to find safety, he moves from one isolated village to another, where nearly every stop exposes him to another horrifying act of human cruelty. Instead of finding compassion, he encounters fear, superstition, betrayal, and violence wherever he goes. The book became infamous because it refuses to spare the reader from these horrors. Throughout the story, the boy witnesses brutal beatings, torture, executions, and acts of cruelty committed by ordinary villagers rather than soldiers. In one unforgettable scene, a woman accused of witchcraft is tied up and violently attacked by an angry mob. In another, a cruel bird catcher paints a small bird in bright colors before releasing it back into the sky, only for the other birds to mistake it for an outsider and peck it to death, which eventually gives the novel its title. Moments like these turned the novel into one of the darkest portrayals of human nature ever written. Because of its graphic violence, disturbing subject matter, and relentless atmosphere of hopelessness, The Painted Bird has been banned and restricted in several schools and libraries over the years. Even today, readers continue debating whether it should be remembered as historical fiction, autobiography, or something in between. The Turner Diaries. Written in 1978 by William Luther Pierce, under the pseudonym Andrew MacDonald, the book presents a fictional story centered on white supremacist ideology and has long been associated with extremist movements. The novel follows Earl Turner, a member of a fictional underground organization determined to overthrow the United States government and ignite a nationwide race war. As the story unfolds, Turner and his followers carry out bombings, political assassinations, robberies, and mass killings, believing that only widespread violence can achieve their goals. One of the book's most infamous scenes describes a truck packed with explosives being driven into a federal building, while later chapters depict public executions and large-scale massacres carried out after the group seizes power. The violence becomes increasingly extreme until the conflict spreads across the entire country. Unlike most controversial novels, the concern surrounding the Turner Diaries extends far beyond fiction. Over the years, investigators found that several violent extremists possessed or referenced the book. The most notorious example was Timothy McVeigh, the man responsible for the 1995 Oklahoma City bombing that killed 168 people. Investigators found pages from the novel in his vehicle, and prosecutors argued that its ideology had heavily influenced him. Similar references to the book have also appeared in investigations involving extremist groups, hate crimes, and planned terrorist attacks in the United States and abroad. Because of these repeated connections to real-world violence, many bookstores have refused to stock the novel, while several countries have restricted or prohibited its distribution under laws targeting extremist material. Even decades after its publication, it remains one of the few novels consistently linked to real-world terrorism.